Welcome to Taiwan versus the world. Today we'll discuss China's gray zone warfare with two guests. The crisis between China and Japan around Taiwan is still waiting on the news, and it's the perfect occasion to observe once more how China conducts its gray zone tactics. We will also look at Japan's announcement of a missile deployment on Yonaguni Island, the closest Japanese territory to Taiwan. But this deployment is part of a bigger narrative and a much longer time frame. Thanks for joining us again. So today with us are Simona Grano and Chen Yu-hua. I may ask you both first to introduce yourself.
Shall I go first? I'm Simona Grano from the University of Zurich, and I head a research division on China-Taiwan relations.
And my name is Yu-hua Chen. I'm from Akita International University. My research has been always about China's security and foreign policy, and also Japan-Taiwan security relations.
So there has been a lot of talks lately about everything that's happening between Japan and China, since China has taken the opportunity of Mrs. Sanae Takaichi's comment on Taiwan to overblow the issue and proceed to perform this kind of gray zone warfare that we have observed from China from many years. So this is a good occasion to discuss it. Both of you in your position. Broadly, let's say, what kind of recent developments have you observed in gray zone warfare from China around both Taiwan and Japan?
Well, I would say, that it's nothing new. I think what's new, I mean, of course, the actions we know in the case of Taiwan, it's almost, daily presence of Chinese military aircraft crossing the median line. You got these large-scale joint military exercises that simulate blockades or cyber operations, which also targeted the government and other institutions, disinformation campaigns during the elections, for instance. But I think what's really new in this case is really how coordinated these actions in the past 3 years have become, because now you really see China blending a variety of techniques, military signaling with the blockades and the exercises, economic pressure towards Taiwan and especially DPP aligned business people, and of course cyber operations, as I said, and influence campaigns in one sort of continuous toolkit. And I think the goal is not to provoke an overnight crisis, but really to sort of steadily erode resistance and normalize China's new presence.
First of all, I think my definition of a gray zone activity or strategy is much more emphasize the element of a military, because I know a lot of scholars try to define what is so-called gray zone warfare or gray zone tactics in different ways. Like they tend to use this definition: a state that try to pressure the other state by exploiting the ambiguity between peace and war, like non-military, quasi-military, economy, information, legal tools, whatever. But I think military element has been always the most important dimension in those tools. Otherwise, this definition will be too broad to be meaningful. And let me focus on the military element in the interaction between between Japan and China nowadays. Chinese government just announced another wave for military exercise in around Yellow Sea, and I think this is one just many tools or card that China tried to pressure Taiwan in order to force Takaichi to take back what she said about Taiwan. And but in the meantime, we also see China seems to be a little bit exercise a bit of a restraint, because the location of exercise is not too productive, right? That is just around Yellow Sea, is around Beijing. It's not really in a much more sensitive area, say the Senkaku Island issue, Senkaku Island. I would say we haven't seen China use a much more military pressure toward Japan, like sending more aircraft or maritime vessels circle around Senkaku Island or even islands of Japan yet, right? So, although we do see in China start to use this gray zone tactic against Japan, but we also see in China seems to exercise a bit of restraint.
So this is very interesting. And before we proceed, this already inspires me two questions, one for each of you. Simona, first, I hear that you talk about China now being much more coordinated in the toolkit it uses on every level. And yet, Yu-hua said that he sees Grayson warfare with more of an emphasis on the military angle. So are you actually in disagreement, or does that match your vision of the situation?
No, I think we are in agreement. I mean, first of all, I was focusing more on what China does towards Taiwan, and he was focusing more on what China does towards Japan. But I would argue with him, and I think I mentioned it before, that in the past few years, and since Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August 2022, we certainly see military exercises and military toolkit having been expanded. I just think that until a few years ago, and until 2016, we never had crossing of the median line, for instance. So in the last few years, that's what I meant is that we see a more coordinated toolkit of all the measures, in my opinion. But clearly, the military angle is probably the strongest one of all. Yes, I agree with him.
Thank you. And Yuhua, you just mentioned that actually there is what you call a certain restraint in the way that China is using military pressure on Japan. And as a matter of fact, since this crisis began, it seems that China is actually kind of pulling its punches in general compared with the kind of coercion it has applied to other countries. Why do you think is it so, or do you even agree with that assessment?
I think, generally speaking, China tried to pressure Japan in all front, right? Information, United Nations, military, and also some diplomatic tools. So I would say probably we will see China try to pressure Japan in a similar way toward that of Taiwan, because we know China tried to send aircraft and the maritime vessels try to circle the island of Taiwan. And I mean, this is something that probably we'll talk about this later. I'm worried that in the future, if this kind of tension escalate, China may choose to use this the same way how it pressure Taiwan to pressure Japan over Senkaku Island as well. I mean, the Japanese government has been trying to calculate how many times per year that China send military aircraft circle waters or areas around the Senkaku Island, about 30 times per year. And if I mean, I'm not sure whether maybe in the future China will try to increase the frequency or try to even approach to the territorial water of the Senkaku Island. And if we see this is a new pattern, and I would say China start to pressure Japan in much of the same way how it pressures Taiwan.
Yeah, this is actually a question that I plan to ask indeed if we are heading towards Japan receiving the Taiwan treatment from China, since the pressure from China on Taiwan has been ongoing for many, many years. The playbook is now very well known. So, Simona, do you agree with this? Do you think that Japan is heading towards being treated the way that Taiwan is being treated?
Oh, I think it depends. I mean, clearly we see the same toolkit being applied now, for example, also with the use of tourism, for example, as a political tool. After the comment that Sanae Takaichi made, of course, we saw the airplanes from China being stopped. So these kind of political tools are, of course, as you asked, already used in the Taiwan context, but we're now seeing them applied to Taiwan as a sort of way to stop
To
the flow of
Japan, you
Chinese
mean?
tourists. Sorry, to Japan, exactly. But whether, in the future we'll have the exact same toolkit, I think also depends on how the situation between Japan and China evolves. Clearly, Taiwan is much more central for China because it believes it should be part of its territory, and that does not apply to Japan. Well, there are territorial disputes, but clearly it's a different context. So I think it depends. We see similar tactics emerging, controlling group tours, using visa privileges, signal displeasure after political territorial disputes. At the moment, as we both said, Sanae Takaichi's comments regarding Taiwan. And economically, we know that certain strategies like tourism, for example, are leveraged already in the context of Taiwan to exert influence. But whether, the same exact toolkit will be applied, I don't think so, because the interest that China has towards Taiwan is very different from the interest it has towards Japan.
And this is inspiring me. This is inspiring me again. A lot of questions, but the first thing that I want to say is Is it actually working? Because all these years of Grayson warfare towards Taiwan at the end of the day achieved very little. Taiwan is still standing quite radically against China and still maintains allies. And we see here that in the case of what's happening around Japan, it has completely failed to even put a dent on the popularity and support that Sanae Takaichi is receiving. So why China insists on such methods when so far we don't see them bringing any fruit for them?
Whether it is working, I think we have two different explanations. One is for domestic audience of Chinese people, the other is for people in Japan, right? So the way how China launched this wave and wave of sanction and coercion toward Japan, people in China they feel very satisfactory, and in some way because this kind of feeling is driven by the nationalism issues, and which is kind of sponsored by the Chinese government. So as a leader in Beijing, they need to do something much more hawkish, much more aggressive toward Japan in order to satisfy the need or the desire of people in China. So it doesn't matter whether this strategy is going to make Takahashi retract her statement. Chinese government already success, right? But in terms of whether this strategy is effective to make Japan retract the statement, or making people in Japan be compliant to pressure China? I would say the answer is, of course, no. Say, let's take the case of tourism as example. Many people in Japan, they already feel the so-called over-tourism issue is kind of problem in Japan. Japan rely so much on tourism, and about one fifth of revenue is of tourism has been always from China. But for many people in Japan, they feel the behavior of Chinese tourists is not so decent and generate some discomfort feeling among people in Japan. So we do see this kind of happening that many people in Japan on their social media talking about if the Chinese tourism is not coming to Japan, that is great because we can have a much more clear much more clean and clear space for those important city in Japan, like Tokyo, Osaka, right? Those are places that most of Chinese tourists will go to. And also and also take an example of those sanctions towards seafood or beef of Japan. I mean, Japanese government since 2010, 2012 already start to think about how to diversify the market that Japan should rely on, not really on China. So I will see. I think what is going to happen is this case between China and Japan is going to become another case between China and Australia. Although Chinese government try to sanction specific product from Australia, but it will only make those sanctioned product go to explore a new market and then become much more successful. So I won't say China's strategy against Japan is very effective in this regard.
First of all, I agree that this is meant to a double audience. You know, there's a nationalistic component of the Chinese population, of course, that you're trying to convince. And then, of course, there is the external population of Taiwan in the case that I'm talking about. So, of course, these measures, as you pointed out in your question, may seem somehow counterproductive. You know, they seem to alienate the population rather than, as they wish, win the hearts and minds. But I think maybe the goal for Beijing, from its perspective, is actually a bit different because it's not about reaching popularity in Taiwan. But I think from the perspective of the CCP is more about a long-term sort of shaping of narratives and elite behavior. So it's a sort of like, you know, a slow burn approach. You try to create structural influence over time rather than reaching a short-term consent. And, you know, if the reaction of the public is negative, China still may think that the long-term effects on institutions and perceptions could serve its goals. But that being said, I think that while such measures, you know, can improve perceptions maybe in the long run or maybe not, for example, you know, business community people, retirees or frequent travelers to China, when we talk about the tourism strategies, I do think that they are really unlikely, in my view, to reverse, you know, longer term trends in Taiwanese civic identity, especially among younger people whose views, I believe, are really shaped by local politics and security concerns rather than, for example, travel convenience. So, you know, when we talk about tourism, maybe easier travel is certainly a soft power needle, that creates some opportunities for China for influence, but it won't overturn at all, maybe deeply rooted identity trends in Taiwan, in my opinion.
This is very interesting, as you both mentioned something that I will react upon. Yu-hua, you talked about Australia, and I was actually working in Australia when this crisis happened with China listing demands, etc. And I remember witnessing that China had an enormous amount of influence on Australia before they
Right.
did this. And after they did this, they achieved nothing except demolishing their popularity in the eyes of the Australian people. And it's exactly as you said. I remembered interviewing the person, the head of the wine industry organization,
Mm.
asking him, "What are you going to do if China doesn't buy wine?" And he said, "Well, what do you think we're going to do? We just look for other places to sell it." And
Right.
business people just like, if a market closed, they go look for another one. They didn't become rich by just being afraid. And if they lose a client, they lose another. They're not going to stop being rich. And Simona, as you said also about tourism, I remember you and I discussed once how young people in Taiwan are not really impressed by propaganda content and easily sort out what is entertainment and what is propaganda and just brush it off. So, what does that tell us actually about this influence operation? Can't China see the effect it actually has?
I think they do see that. I think the hope at the moment in sort of like also employing these new tools for, visa, for example, is also connected maybe to the choice of the new KMT chair, who they think, maybe, of course, is much more, prone and Beijing friendly and whom they hope will win in a couple of years. And so they're, as usual, I think they're employing this double pronged strategy in which they bash the DPP on the head by this signal, hoping that the population will follow, that they are actually, willing to talk to one part of the population and one party in Taiwan. And as you pointed out, so far, even in the case of other countries, but even in the case of Taiwan, all the things that they have done have failed spectacularly because usually when they put their minds, the CCP, on, for example, opposing certain candidates, in that case, certain candidates have won. I think about 96, but also with Tsai Ing-wen in 2020, although that was also due to the fact that the Taiwanese saw what was going on in Hong Kong. So whether they can see that or not, I think, tourism for the PRC, it's also a united front work strategy. They think that they can build contacts with business owners and cultural institutions, overseas Chinese organizations, not only in Taiwan and Japan, but also in the West. They have these sister city programs, information campaigns presenting China as an indispensable partner. All of these things are going on from China and directed not just to Japan and Taiwan, but all over the world. And I think we failed to see that for a long time. We thought, even in Switzerland until 10 years ago, that, twin city programs are just very good for everyone and they are just, something that is related to culture. But in reality, the CCP was spreading its influence. So to go back to what they think, to a certain extent, even though they're not winning hearts and minds, they have managed to establish a network of people that are sympathetic to the CCP cause or even ignore that they're being actually utilized and instrumentalized. And in that case, they've been quite successful, unfortunately.
We raised the hypothesis that all of this is also for domestic consumption in China. But of course, it is extremely difficult to know what the Chinese people really think. It's an enormous population that is being under pressure of controlling its speech. That doesn't have freedom of speech. But we also see signs sometimes that many Chinese people are primarily concerned with economic issues and quality of life and employment, etc. We see young people being disenfranchised and indulging in tankping and this kind of things. So, is there really that much demand for nationalism and warmongering among the Chinese population when they seem to have a lot of much more pressing concerns?
My observation is about 50-50. Right. We do have many Chinese people with liberal mind. They know this is Chinese government's propaganda, and this kind of anti-Japanese feeling is not really necessary. It will only hurt Chinese people who purchase Japanese product like cars, and somehow they don't want to see more hatred going on between people in Japan and people in China. I mean, if it's, many of you may remember, a couple of months ago, some Japanese kids were killed in China, and we do see many Chinese people. They try to talk about we need to stop this hatred of generations. But on the other hand, many I would say older generation, especially who were born after around 1990s, 2000s. They were still heavily influenced by the Chinese education, which were many focused on anti-Japanese sentiment. And these group peoples, if they suffer economic hardship, sometimes they will blame much more easily to blame other countries. So this is what we are seeing the pattern. Those who attack people in Japan are those people who've been less educated and less influenced by other countries. So I mean, it's a very difficult to say to what extent that people in China are really influenced by this Chinese education or anti-Japanese sentiments. But for leaders in Beijing, they kind of have these assumptions. Whatever conflict going up with Japan and to some extent with the United States, they need to behave much more tough. And in order to satisfy their domestic audience, although we will never know, it's the true figure is very hard to come by.
Mm. Yeah, and just very briefly to that, I think also there may be a mismatch between what the party does and what the Chinese people think and want to do. I mean, I think there was a study conducted a couple of years ago by an American university. I don't know how they did it, but apparently they managed in Fujian province on the willingness to participate to a war against Taiwan. And the overwhelming majority of people said, of course not. So there is absolutely, I think, a nationalistic component in Chinese society, even more so, I would say, with the very young generations, because in the past 10 years and since Xi Jinping has arrived, he has instituted a variety of much more love the motherland nationalistic programs. But I do think that the majority of the Chinese people, especially after Corona pandemic, actually care much more about their quality of life, just like many other youth in other countries, and that this kind of techniques don't work that much. But there may be a mismatch between also what the party in Beijing thinks is important. And for them, it's also a way, to try and keep the population tied to some ideals in the aftermath of the time in which, the so-called implicit social contract, we deliver you, economic growth, but you won't ask for political rights, has clearly come to an end because there is a very widespread economic recession.
All right, thanks a lot. Circling back to tourism as a gray zone warfare, uh, we see it now happening with China trying to limit the number of Chinese visitors to Japan, but we see it also with Taiwan, with a highly restricted number of Chinese people allowed to visit Taiwan. We see also the opposite being done with China trying to lure in typically European people by letting them enter visa free, etc., etc. So let's discuss a bit this topic broadly. What do you observe? Does it work or not? How is it being used?
Just very briefly, I think it's a political pressure tool, as we said before. When there is displeasure at the political level, China suddenly can, shut down the faucet, and then tourist flows don't come in. It's also a sort of narrative shaping tool because, you can, especially in the case of Taiwan, try to shape the idea that there is this cultural sameness. You organize curated itineraries that are focused on shared culture, ancestral ties, and you frame Taiwan within the broader Chinese national identity. So there is this unification narrative. It's also, as I said before, a united front work strategy, which is meant, I think, especially when Chinese people go to Taiwan in this case, at intelligence gathering. You got mapping of local vulnerabilities. And of course, not all Chinese tourists are spies, but it's difficult to know if some people are de facto spies. You map strategic infrastructure, logistic chains, and so on and so forth. It's, as I said before, a contact building operation with elites, local business owners, cultural institutions, which China thinks in the long run, just like with Hong Kong, will serve its purposes, right? Elite capturing. And finally, I think it also has two other sort of sector the aspects: economic dependency, right? You think you're taking the other country hostage if you, for example, retract tourist flows. It happened in 2017 after Tsai Ing-wen started to become the president in Taiwan, but it's happening now in the case of Japan and on and off. And also psychological and symbolic influence finally, because you sort of like you grant or you remove visa privileges as a reward or a punishment, and you open certain travel channels and you present that in China as goodwill, implying that, stability depends on that country's compliance towards you.
It relates to one idea that I want to emphasize, which is called building supply chain resilience, right? So I think start from 2012 and 2014, when China used economic sanction toward the Philippines and then South Korea over the South issues. Countries in the Indo-Pacific regions, they kind of have this consensus. They try to find a way to make China weaponize this economic interdependence futile, right? So so that is the pattern we are seeing. So every time when China try to sanction a country, maybe through tourism, maybe through specific product, the other country in these Indo-Pacific regions, they'll try to come out and try to help, try to sell the product or encourage the tourism. And this is a pattern that we have seen in, say, case between Japan and Taiwan. So a couple of years ago, when Taiwan's pineapple was sanctioned by China, and then Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe started to try to sell Taiwanese pineapple in Japan on his social media. And we also see this is something happening in Taiwan as well. Lai Ching-te and the other politicians in Taiwan start to talk about how delicious Japanese seafood is. So encourage every Taiwanese consumers to purchase more Japanese seafood. So I can see even if Chinese tourists do not really go to Japan, and of course, it will make the Japanese tourist business hurt in the short term. But in the longer term, we might see other countries in the Indo-Pacific regions, like South Korea, like Australia, or even Taiwan. They will start to encourage people in those countries start to visit Japan. So I think this is kind of consensus building among by the many leaders in the Indo-Pacific regions, and also somehow shared by people in those countries as well.
This is interesting what you are saying here because you're brushing on the concept of international cooperation, coordination on how to tackle gray zone warfare. So, since we established that now these methods are very well known and that several countries had to experience it and to develop their own countermeasures, do you, both of you, observe more and more countries coordinating and acting together against it?
Lithuania is another good example. When Lithuania just opened another Taiwanese official institution in Lithuania, and Chinese sanction comes in, and people in Taiwan try to purchase product from Lithuania. So I think we kind of have this idea that we're all community of the shared destiny. We need to help each other to counter this kind of Chinese weaponize its market.
Yeah, I would say, it depends a little bit which countries in the world we're talking about, whether they are coordinating or not. Of course, what helps is the fact that since 5 years, I would say, especially after Corona, the issue of Taiwan is not just what China previously wanted and thought, an internal issue by proxy, because it was only, cross-strait related and important for the US, but it has become much more internationalized. And many more countries are aware of the reverberation effect it would have if something were to happen to Taiwan. And that has helped, I think, in talking about the kind of technique, including gray zone tools, that China uses against Taiwan and try to come up with strategies to coordinate against it. Whether that's always very successful, in Europe, at least, I'm not so sure, but it's already very positive. For example, that 3 weeks ago we had Xiao King speaking at the European Parliament. Puma Shen also came to Germany a couple of weeks ago. So I think spreading the news of what's going on in Taiwan really helps also Taiwan to internationalize its cause and help maybe countries to think of effective means to counter these strategies by China.
Yes, this is exactly what we are doing, trying to internationalize the issue, talking to the world about Taiwan. So, in your opinion, both of you, what do you think should be done against this gray zone warfare? What are options that haven't been explored, or at least not enough yet, and that countries could use to counter this gray zone warfare?
Very briefly, I would just observe in the case, for example, of Switzerland and many other countries that still our politicians are scared of speaking out against China when it does things like that, when it tries to censor, for example, events on Taiwan because of fear of economic retaliation. And this is really something that we should be changing because, especially for small countries like Switzerland, we should be aware of the fact that, if a big country can just completely neglect the international rules-based order, that may not be good news for us in the future. So I think, to your very practical question, what should be done? We could be starting, for example, by calling China by its name when it does certain things, by calling out against it, and by trying to better coordinate a response with other countries so that we can limit the damage that it is doing by changes, for example, the status quo and normalizing certain situations which should not be normalized and were not the case just until a few years ago.
And in my view, probably we need to let the citizens in each countries know what China doing is really counter the shared values, is really trying to change the international order. I know who is the revision state going to change in international has been always a debate whether it is United States or China. But I mean, at least what China is doing, I mean, it doesn't matter it doesn't matter how a country is going to counter against China or not. It always need some support from its citizens. So to let the citizen knows, those countries, it is necessary for those countries to stand together and to push back when the international order is being altered. That is the most important thing. And I think in this case between China and Japan. Right now, this is what Japanese politician has been doing. Some politician in Japan, like Onoda, the Minister of Economic Security, she tried to emphasize the idea that we need to diversify our market. I mean, the current tension with China is very important to serve as a lesson that we really need to think about whether we should entangle or deep, the economy depend on China so much. So I think this is a good start that try to let the citizen know it's time for a change.
That sounds like a proper conclusion. Briefly, before we wrap it up, actually, I would ask you any good news? Did you ever observe a measure that was taken by a country to counter China's gray zone warfare that actually worked? Do you have an example, each of you?
I think the case of Australia was a very obvious, right? So Australia tried to coordinate with other countries in the Pacific regions and try to diversify the market that it should rely on, like a wheat, like a lobster, like a wine. And I believe this is going to serve as a model that how other countries try to counter-react against Chinese economic sanctions and coercions.
Yeah, and to a similar extent, I would say the Lithuania case, which you mentioned before, is really something that, when it happened, that they allowed the Taiwanese representative office with the name Taiwan rather than Taipei delegation or the usual name. China retaliated economically speaking, and the EU was forced to help out Lithuania and also increasingly discuss what to do with economic coercion tools. And now we're much more careful. I'm not saying it's just because of that. It's also, of course, all the dumping practices that China has and all that has happened in between. But certainly, these kind of incidents and things that happen make us realize much more how China uses gray zone tactics and gives us idea how to, be counter effective against them.
However, in Switzerland, you are not in the European Union, so you are going to develop your own tools for coordination, right?
Yeah, I'm half Italian, so sometimes I speak from the Italian side of, of me and half Swiss. But yes, you're absolutely right. Although I have to say that maybe that's a topic for another podcast. Switzerland is a very friendly towards China country. And so contacts towards Taiwan are really cut to the bare minimum. Although it has a robust economic trade relations, it's the fifth partner in Asia. I have to say our politicians, in my view, are very much careful of saying anything. And especially there's a division among parties. The leftist parties are more pro-Taiwan, while the right-wing parties are more pro-China. So it's a very complicated issue.
I guess when we talk, Simona, this is our Italian halves that are discussing. This is interesting, actually, what you say. One last final note that the leftist parties are more pro-Taiwan in Switzerland because this is not what we hear in other countries, where it is more like the right parties that are for Taiwan.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me as well. It used to be different, of course, in the 60s and 70s when the right-wing parties in Switzerland still, of course, were against the communists and so pro actually, of course, the ROC, Taiwan. But now it's changed completely, and the party that speak out and also go and send parliamentarian delegations are mostly from the Greens or the SP, the Socialist Party. There's someone also in the right-wing parties, but in general, I would say it's more the leftist and the middle.
Simona A, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you for your comments.
Thank you for
Thank you very
inviting
much
us.
for the invitation.
On other news, Japan has also announced the deployment of missiles on Yonaguni Island. The island is barely over 100 kilometers away from Taiwan, making it the closest Japanese territory to us. We spoke with Koga about it, and he told us what kind of missiles are planned for the island.
I'm Koga, from the Nanyang Technological University. I'm the associate professor, specializing in the Indo-Pacific or East Asia security, particularly focusing on the alignment in the Pacific, such as the alliance and also the Quad or the multilateral frameworks. So these are my specialty. This missile is not the attacking other countries. It's more like the defensive purpose. So it doesn't actually threaten any of the military the arsenals coming from outside. It's more like the airplanes which have the intention to attack or like the threaten the Japanese security.
Michael Cunningham also shared his insights.
So I'm Michael Cunningham. I'm currently a non-resident fellow at the Center for China Studies at National Taiwan University, but I'm based in Washington, D.C. Yonaguni Island is only about 100 kilometers away from Taiwan, so it really does, it makes Japan, in truth, the closest country to the main island of Taiwan. So yeah, I know in policy circles throughout the world, there's this tendency to see Taiwan as more of a U.S. interest, and that Japan somehow doesn't care or doesn't care enough what happens in Taiwan. But it's really the other way around, is that Taiwan is more a Japan interest than more of an interest for Japan than for most other countries. Just because of the proximity. And so Yonaguni has been, it is literally the closest foreign territory to Taiwan. And so recently there's been, of course, a flare up because of a comment that Prime Minister Takaichi said. And sort of the latest iteration of this has just been the announcement that they're going to base some missiles on Yonaguni.
Recently, the defense minister Koizumi actually mentioned about Japan's plan to deploy the surface-to-air missiles in the Yonaguni, which is actually located near Taiwan, around like 110 kilometer away from the Taiwan island. And then that actually created the criticism coming from China. And then it became the big news recently.
But the announcement did not come as a surprise. There is history around Yonaguni, and the missile deployment does not appear to be directly related to the current tensions between Japan and China over Taiwan. In short, it happens at the same time by pure coincidence.
Yonaguni's militarization has been ongoing for quite some time. I'm not sure how much, if any, the latest flare-up with China had in the most recent decision to station more or to place more missiles on the island. The militarization of the island has been ongoing for quite some time. It is in a very strategic location. And frankly, China's activities around Taiwan pose a direct threat to Yonaguni Island. When the PLA is operating that close to your territory, you are going to do something to protect your territory, not because you think they're going to attack it, but because you'd be foolish not uh, to make preparations for that in case it ever did occur. And so, regardless of what's happening around Taiwan, uh, with that much PLA activity near the island, you would expect them to take their security very seriously. And so, yes, I synchronized almost by chance is probably a correct way of portraying it.
At the same time, it was actually planned quite a long time. I mean, if you actually think about Japan's defense plan from the 2000s to the 2010s, then Japan has been concerned about the rapidly increasing Chinese military capabilities, and also its kind of naval the advancement to the East China Sea and beyond. There are many actually military ships going through Okinawa islands, and then they were really concerned to what extent China actually wants to have military presence in the Western Pacific. And then because Japan was concerned about these developments, they actually started to change its national defense policy from gradually from the 2010, and then they started to allocate their military assets from north to the southern islands, which include the Okinawa. And then in this context, Japanese the government started to allocate the SDF Self-Defense Force kind of assets to the Okinawa Islands. And then this is the missile deployment is a kind of part of it. What kind of like missiles, where like the bases or like where those kind of missiles should be located? These are some kind of like the discussions that the Japanese governments need to do with among their ministries and also the agencies within, and also they need to have the accountability to the public too. So in that sense, these specifics are not necessarily detailed out like in the past, but I guess everybody kind of expected that those assets are coming to the southern islands in Japan. And I guess the specific locations like Yonaguni, and then like recently they decided to actually locate their missiles in the Kumamoto camp too. That is the new development. So again, the specifics could be the new, but then the in long term, if you actually see the Japanese defense policy development, you could see it's coming, and then it's not like necessarily like big surprise for everyone.
The move has significance for Japan, but it is also important in the current discourse around what constitutes an existential threat to Japan and what kind of signals it sends to the region and to the United States.
I don't think the Singapore is taking the side on these issues, but then I think they were concerned about the development because the tensions between Japan and China. It's not good for the regional stability and security. So what they actually hope for is that those countries actually come together and then they calm down and then they negotiate for the further kind of the mediation or mitigation of the tension. Even though the Singapore has strong ties with the China economically, Singapore also has the strong tie with Japan economically and politically too. So in that sense, it's not like good for the Singapore to take the express position to take sides to the one particular country, and then for now, I think they don't actually mention explicitly what's the Singapore stands for. I guess they are trying to wait and see because this kind of situation might be the short term, which might not, but we don't know. So in that sense, for now, like they are actually want to see if the tension is going to be mitigated pretty soon. But if not, maybe they would actually make the certain kind of statement. But then for now, like it's a wait and see kind of posture.
Well, the ASEAN countries are really trying to stay neutral in everything. I don't see it as being posing a direct threat to other countries. It's China that's interested there. But I do think this this Japan-China flare-up is of interest to the entire region. Takeichi's comments, I think, were really important for Japan. Now, they caused a diplomatic crisis that Japan really didn't need. It's really, to me, lamented. But at the same time, Japan needs to keep the U.S. engaged. And the U.S. Support for Taiwan is still very strong, but there are certain political groups in the U.S. that are really souring on U.S. involvement in Asia, and in particular Taiwan. There's a sense that now these are so far certainly not mainstream views, but they're growing in popularity, and there's a sense that well, there's going to be a war over Taiwan, and if we continue to support them, we're going to be dragged into a war with China. And who wants to fight a war with China? I mean, honestly, nobody wants that. And so there is this false, incorrect view of China's intentions, inaccurate view of their intentions that is leading people to assume that conflict is imminent and it's going to happen regardless of anything that we or anyone else does to deter it. And part of the idea has been that America is in this alone and no one else would step in to support Taiwan. There's this idea that America would have to twist Japan's arm just to get Japan to let us use our own military bases in Japan in the event of a conflict with China over Taiwan. And I have long argued that it would probably be more like Japan twisting our arm to join them in supporting Taiwan, because that is an existential threat. A war over the Taiwan Strait or a Chinese takeover of Taiwan would pose an existential threat to Japan objectively.
On other news, Taiwan approves a $40 billion defense boost. The government has announced a supplementary armed defense budget. It is the largest in years and it aims to strengthen Taiwan's air defense and deterrence capabilities. New Zealand Navy transits the Taiwan Strait. The Navy's oiler ship made a rare crossing through the strait, showing Wellington's ongoing interest in freedom of navigation. And finally, Taiwan's Premier Cho Chung-tai reiterated that a so-called return to China is not an option for its 23 million people. This is in response to Chinese leader Xi Jinping reiterating this concept to US President Donald Trump during a call. We will meet again next week to explore more of these topics. Talk to you soon.